China's repression of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang is perhaps the worst-kept secret of the communist state. But this week, there's been a damning report by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights which outlines in grave detail the systematic and organized crimes that are being carried out by the Chinese state against its Muslim minorities. Now, many of these Muslim minorities are primarily the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. These may constitute as crimes against humanity. That was the conclusion of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. It is being considered a landmark report. The statement came after a year-long investigation by the UN body into the northwestern region of China. In this particular province, China houses more than 1 million Uyghurs and other mostly Muslim ethnic minority groups. Many of them have been subjected to mass internment, forced labor, and physical and mental torture. But there was a lot of drama in the run-up to the release of this report. China had tried by hook or by crook to try and delay this report. Following a series of delays and intense lobbying by Beijing to block the report, the victims and their families had feared that it would get permanently shut out or it would fail to hold the Chinese authorities to account. However, Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president who ended her tenure as the human rights chief of the United Nations this week, she delivered the report on her very last day in office. The report not only describes the horrific nature of the crimes, but also fixes the blame on the Chinese authorities. On Crux Decode, will this UN report actually hold China accountable, or will it be consigned to the dustbin of history? Have United Nations reports in the past shown any teeth to indict states for so-called human rights violations? And most importantly, can countries in the West, the United States included, accuse China of human rights violations when their own record is patchy? This UN report is extremely important. It paves the way for meaningful and tangible action by member states, UN bodies, and the business community. That is according to Dolkun Isa, the president of the World Uyghur Congress, which is an advocacy group. Among the United Nations findings is a pattern of large-scale arbitrary detentions which occurred in Xinjiang between 2017 and 2019. Based on interviews of dozens of first-hand witnesses, the United Nations report details a pattern of torture which is cruel, inhuman, or degrading. And there are credible allegations of sexual and gender-based violence, including rape. Their accounts included being beaten with batons, electric batons, while being strapped onto a so-called tiger chair, being subjected to interrogation with water being poured into their faces, prolonged solitary confinement, and being forced to sit motionless on small stools for prolonged periods of time. A tiger chair basically restrains a prisoner while he or she is being interrogated. Detainees were also subjected to constant hunger and constant surveillance. They were forced to memorize red songs and other propaganda of the Chinese Communist Party. They were also mandated to take regular injections and pills which made them drowsy. The extent of arbitrary and discriminatory detention of members of the Uyghur community may constitute crimes against humanity. That was the finding of the UN report. But William Ni, who's a research and advocacy coordinator at the Chinese Human Rights Defenders, says that while this report is often written in a very cautious and hedging language as used most times, the concerns raised will be very hard for the Chinese government to refute. Now, although these findings will not immediately change the situation on the ground, at the very least, they should give courage to governments in the West who have been reluctant to speak out for millions of Uyghur victims. Also, governments of Islamic countries in the Gulf and in other regions. But there are also some serious questions that are being asked about the utility of such a report. First things first, such UN human rights reports have very little consequence. They are not legally tenable, so which means even if some of the victims were to sue the Chinese state in the International Court of Justice or any other international court of law, it will not amount to much legally because it's not binding on China. The other important thing is that the United Nations Security Council cannot take cognizance of this report or take any action basis this report because China happens to be a permanent member. China has veto power. And more importantly, it also has a fellow permanent member and friend in Russia who too will oppose any such attempt to try and single out China or hold it to account. Previous reports in other instances where the United Nations has gone into human rights violations has also not had any kind of real consequence. The UN report on Kashmir, for example, has been in deep freezer. There's been no tangible action against the Saudi government after the UN report on the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So there are also serious questions being asked about the credibility of the report itself. Like I said earlier, it was published just hours before Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, was going to demit office. It happened on her very last day as the UN High Commissioner. Also, human rights is a very tricky subject. China too has been pointing fingers at the United States, particularly the treatment of blacks and Hispanic immigrants. There is a great deal of documentation of how white police officers have used disproportionate force against black suspects, sometimes even leading to their death in the instance of George Floyd, which sparked off the Black Lives Matter protests across the United States. There have also been heartbreaking scenes of Hispanic immigrants at the borders of America being separated from their families because the previous Donald Trump administration repealed the Dreamers Act and was also hell-bent on building a wall with its border with Mexico. Here's a background, though, to China's actions inside Xinjiang. Since 2017, China has dramatically expanded police control over Xinjiang, which has about 13 million Muslim population out of the region's 25 million. The UN report has stopped short of giving an exact figure for the number of people who've been detained or subject to abuses. But an earlier UN report had estimated this figure at around 1 million. It noted Beijing's position that the number of detainees taking part in education and training was hard to estimate. But it also said that it is reasonable to conclude that a pattern of large-scale arbitrary detention has happened and continues to happen. China insists that the system has been reduced in scope. A trend towards more and longer imprisonments in Xinjiang's criminal justice system strongly suggests that there's been a shift towards formal incarcerations and not informal ones. Some Western governments, including the US and UK, have called for the United Nations to start a formal investigation. Among its recommendations, the UN report urged Beijing to release all individuals who've been arbitrarily deprived of their liberty. Also to give their families details about their whereabouts. The Chinese government, it said, should investigate allegations of torture, sexual violence, ill treatment, forced medical treatment, as well as forced labor and death. The UN also published China's own report defending its fight against terrorism and extremism in Xinjiang. In fact, Zhang Jun, who is China's representative at the UN, said that the so-called Xinjiang issue is a completely fabricated lie to undermine China's stability and to obstruct China's development. Also, China would still have an opportunity to closely manage the criticism arising from this report because it was released less than a fortnight before the last Human Rights Council session of 2022. And like I said earlier, Michelle Bachelet has demitted office. We don't know who her successor is going to be. The UN space is not a level playing field. China's rise within the UN system and also the fact that it has veto powers in the Security Council mean that China can never be held accountable. All that will happen is some shadow boxing.